Welcome back, ID60. This week we are going into the principles of design and how they apply to interiors, styling, and staging. So these are just sort of a list of all of the principles we're going to go through. And there's always a little bit of confusion around the difference between elements and principles. So elements, what we talked about last week, are the sort of very basic tools that we use to help us develop space. So they're basically the what. So it's color, texture, line, all of those things. The principles are how we use those things in order to create the feeling that we want in a space. So I always think of it as like the alphabet. So the elements are the alphabet. So like color is A, texture might be B, but when I start putting those things together using principles, I start creating words. So it starts getting more complicated and more complicated. And then as you get into bigger design ideas and you get into these ideas of concept, which really we deal with in our interior design program, the full program, you start stringing together words that create sentences, that create stories. And so you're telling these stories not only with elements and principles, but like the idea of the client and how, you're stringing all those things together. And so you're turning this sort of idea in your head into something that becomes tangible in space. So elements and principles, core key elements to making a space beautiful, function, but also tell a story. And so also in the idea of staging and the idea of designing a space, for sure. A space for photography, you're definitely telling a story about a client. So you're making sure that you understand your client's intention and personality, and then hopefully applying these elements and principles to that. So let's get started. So we sort of went over my personal definition. So let's go over the formal definitions. So the principles of design are the guiding rules that ensure a space is visually appealing and functional. And so the difference, the elements we talked about are sort of the what. So it's the line, shape, color, texture, as opposed to the principles are the how. How are we using the lines? How are we using the shapes? How are we combining those things to talk about this bigger idea or to give the feeling that we want in a particular space? So principles matter because they create harmony and order. They enhance usability and flow. And then they also influence mood and perception. So our first one we're going to look at is symmetrical balance. So symmetrical balance you can think of as if each one of these rooms or images was a piece of paper, and you actually took a line and divided it right down the center, and then you folded it. Would it be exactly the same on both sides? So in interiors, it's typically slightly different, but the intention is that it's pretty much symmetrical. So when I'm looking at this sort of center idea, I have the same lamps on each side. The light fixtures on the fireplace are the same. The chairs on each side are the same. And the sofa is centered directly on the fireplace. So for the most part, it's symmetrical. When I look here, again, I see symmetry. I have the same mirrors on each side, same chairs, same lamps, sofa, etc. So symmetrical means that if I have a line that happens down the center and I fold it, it's for the most part exactly the same on each side. Whereas asymmetrical balance means that if I folded it, just like I did in that example of symmetry, they would be different on each side. So they still want to be balanced, meaning that the weight is somewhat the same, so that one half of the room doesn't look more full than the other half, but they're doing that in a way that's different. So when I look at this image, I have my fireplace. I'm drawing a line right down the center. There's a full sofa here, and there's 2 chairs here. So it is not symmetrical. It is balanced. And the way that they did that is they added darker pillows on this side. And the darker the color, the heavier for us it tends to feel. So even though the space is not full on this side, like it is on this side, the weight or the darkness of the pillows balances it out. When I look on this side, I have, again, drawing my line. And this one's really not symmetrical, right? This one, it still has the fireplace, same on both sides. This one, they've created a different element on this side. Even the opening in the fireplace is not centered on the table. So this one is really asymmetrical, and they're using, again, color to bring it that balance. So when I look at the beige chairs over here, it pulls in and helps to balance the beige that's happening over here in the fireplace. There's a darker tone, or I should say a medium tone, that's happening in the center that helps sort of ground the whole space. So it's not as dark as the black, but it's not as light as the cream color. So again, that medium sort of helps ground it and center it. But this one definitely asymmetrical. You have these sort of light, wiry chairs on one side and a heavier sofa on the other side. But what helps the room be balanced is that they're pulling the color in at this diagonal, right? So I have the color here, color here, color here, little sort of color here that's pulling. So again, it's helping it be balanced with color. We have radial balance. So this is when I have an element that's in the center and things happen around it. It doesn't necessarily have to be circular, but that's kind of how we perceive radial most of the time. And in this case, not only is the table round, but all the elements that are moving around it are actually also curved and softened. But you can see there's a radial dynamic here where all of those chairs are looking in on that table. Same is happening here, except now I have a booth that's kind of squared off. But again, typically a dining room situation is a radial organization. And then we have repetition. So repetition is when things repeat in space. So they tend to make a space look very organized. It tends to give the space movement. It carries your eye through a space. So in this case, all of these beds are exact replicas of each other. And because they're happening in a very organized way and repeating each other, actually they're mirrored, right? It gives the room a very organized look. You know what to expect. There's nothing that is changing. So to most human beings, it feels very organized, even maybe a little stiff. Here's another one that is repeating down a long space. So the first thing that sort of catches my eye is the light fixture, right? These shapes are repeating down it looks like a hotel lobby. So it's carrying me to the end, the same as these sort of ottomans that are sitting here. Then I have the sofas that are duplicating and the chairs that are duplicating. Even the rail makes me kind of want to go play it like an instrument as it moves in and through that space. So for me, this idea of repetition, because it's happening over and over, going in sort of one direction, tends to create movement, where this one, because it's only happening once, creates more stability. So again, you can use it in different ways. Progression. So progression is when you have a space and it's moving sort of from one idea to another idea. So in this case, I have a square entertainment unit, and then it sort of goes from a square roundish chair to a sort of hard roundish table, and then it transitions into a very soft and rounded sofa. So it's ultimately going from really hard, really square to really curved, really soft, and then you have some things in between that are doing the transition. So progression is the sort of transition, in this case, of shape and also of texture, because it's going from really hard to really soft, from really square to really curved. In this case, and I love spaces that do this because it makes me know that the designer of the space really took into consideration the flow of how the rooms connect to each other. So when I look at this space, I see that this hallway has this wallpaper on it that's this sort of dark pink fuchsia color. But the main color in this next room is a turquoisey blue. But when I look at the area rug, when I look at this sofa, it pulls back in this color. So there's a very clear connection between the two spaces without them having to be exactly the same. It feels like what's happening in the hallway is very light and very bright. What's happening in this space is a little darker, more, I don't want to say somber, but definitely more calm. But there is definitely a connection because they pulled in that color from the hallway. So it's a progression of color. And then we have movement. So we saw a lot of movement and repetition. And we talked about in the last lecture that one of the things that gives us movement is also line. So when you start to look at the lines of things, they will lead you in the direction that the designer wants you to see, hopefully, especially in staging. That's really important because we're leading the eye to the items or the features in the house that are most important or the most cherished, right? So in this case, we have the sofa and it's a high back, or I shouldn't say high back. It's actually like a chaise, and the high back is happening here. So this is almost like a stop. So when I walk into a sofa back, it really stops me from moving into the rest of the space. Whereas if it's open, so it's actually high back and then it comes down and opens, it's lending itself to having an open flow in the space. So this sofa, the lines of it is saying, okay, this is where this room starts and it's flowing this way and it's pointing me right to this sort of gorgeous view, right? Here, I have these chairs that are open so I can actually see through the mesh in this back so it's not obstructing the view. So that's important. And also there's many of them. If this was a big, solid, chunky thing, it would, again, just like the back of the sofa, sort of snap me. And so all of these lines, you can kind of see a line and I didn't go into this in the last lecture, or maybe I did. We have what's called a datum, and a datum is how you organize things, and it works not only as an element but also as a principle. And so when I'm looking at this cushion and these tables, I kind of see a line of how they are centered, and that line again is pushing out towards the window. So all of these elements are pushing me in and making me look towards this view. So same here, I have this sofa that's kind of curving me around, pointing me out to the view. And then I have these sort of low-lying chairs, again, with a lot of space happening. If this was a sofa and it came straight across and it cut off the view, it wouldn't be as pleasant a space, and it wouldn't express how important that view is. And then we have emphasis. So emphasis, you're wanting to create a focal point. And this always feels like an anchor in the space. So when I look at this wall, the green wall is obviously a focal point. It has these, I want to say, mullions on them. millwork that is all painted the same color, but because of the light, it's giving highlights and shadows. So it makes it look really interesting. And it's a very big contrast to everything else in the space, right? The furniture and all the other finishes are neutrals. They're browns and whites. So this is the only true color that's happening in the space beside the plant. And it's all tying together. It's almost the exact same green as the plants. So this is creating a focal point because it's a contrast in texture. It's also a contrast in color. When we get here, another super high contrast, because this room is for the most part really sort of dark browns, dark grays. And then I put this very vibrant wallpaper on the wall. So technically it's flat, but it is creating visual texture, and it's definitely an emphasis in color, right? So there's a very bright color against this very dark room, and then they're pulling that color out into the space a bit with the orange colored chair. And contrast. So, and I actually love all these principles. I when I walk into a space, I'm always looking for them because it's what really makes a space interesting. But I like this space because a lot of times with architecture, big open spaces are really what's trending and what's popular. It's what a lot of people want, but it tends sometimes to just lay flat. In this case, I think the designer did a really nice job of creating this big open space that's very bright, very white, obviously has a lot of windows, but the kitchen became its own separate entity, right? So I have this big white room, right? And it's light, it's bright, it's airy, but I do a very definite transition into another space. And I know clearly that it's a transition. It's a different room because it goes super dark, right? All the walls are dark. The millwork is dark. The counter is white. So it brings back in that color. And there are some black pillows. I can count them, 4 black pillows that sort of pull that black back in. So again, there is that transition. But very clearly, this is a space and this is a space. Even though it's all open to each other, there's a very clear delineation between living space and kitchen, just solely based on color. This can also happen just in a single room. So in this case, it looks like a kitchen again, or maybe a wine bar. But the walls, for the most part, are dark, but the island is white. So it's creating that contrast, making the island stand out and be super important, but also because of the lighting, which is another layer, it's making these wine bottles super important too. So more contrast, rough versus smooth. So in this case, it's really interesting when you have things that are the same color, but one is flat and one is textured. So it gives it a level of depth. Which I think is really nice. So you can still be really subtle. Like if you have a client who's really just wanting a tone on tone, open space, and maybe just the artwork, they want the artwork to be focused, but you don't want the space to lay flat. You really, really, really want to start punching your textures. So in this case, that's what's happening. I have a white wall and a headboard that has some texture to it. And then lighting becomes really important because you want to make sure that you're lighting so you're picking up those textures. In this case, we talked about real versus implied texture. So this one is real texture, meaning I touch it, I can feel it. This one is a marble grain. So it technically is smooth, but it's giving texture, right? It's visual texture. So when I look at this black cabinet and it has a marble backsplash with a marble counter, it's contrasting because it's something that has only one solid color versus something that is marble. I don't know how to say it. It has streaks in it, gray streaks. And then I also have my wood happening under here that gives me a third texture. This one's really nice too. So again, I have this wood wall, and when you're dealing with texture, again, lighting is super important. I have these wall grazers that are above the wood wall, and they're enhancing this texture, not only the texture in the wall, but the texture of the photograph. But then in addition, I have the texture of this cushion. I have the texture of the rug. I have this fluffy pillow. So this room, even though it's really has no color at all, it's all neutrals, meaning grays, dark browns, and whites. Its only sort of interesting features are the textures, right? Textures and shapes. So again, depending on what your client is looking for, if they're really wanting a monochromatic space, then texture becomes super, super important. So contrast large versus small. So I really liked this picture because I think it emphasizes a lot of things that we've talked about. We have contrast of print here, large print, small print, contrast of textures in the bedspread, contrast of textures in this lamp versus the headboard. But then we also have these little tiny pictures that happen above the headboard that I thought were really interesting. We can see it's not a very big fireplace, but we have this art above the fireplace that's probably what we would consider a typical size. But instead of doing something that large over the headboard, they did like a collage of smaller things to not overpower or to make too busy, probably, all of the things that are happening on this bed that I think are kind of yummy. I like it. So again, the contrast of this very small collage, and I think it's really contrasting this whole bed setup. Or it could be something that's really big, like this dining room. Again, pretty minimalist, gray walls, white ceiling, wood table. And then we have this really large light fixture that's orange, right? So it's a contrast in color, it's a contrast in size. When I walk into this space, I'm definitely looking up. It's the first thing I'm seeing because it is so different. And here, I'm not sure if this would be the first thing I look at. I think it would definitely be interesting. But it's, for me, this is a contrast of a whole, whereas this is demanding attention. So again, what your goals are lets you decide how you're going to use these strategies. So contrast we've talked about in color in some of the previous slides. So this is neutrals versus color. And again, this room for the most part pretty neutral, but then they put this really bright, colorful wallpaper up with a chair that pulls in that orange. And this really nice sort of subtle black and white kitchen. And for black and white, I feel like it's pretty soft tones. There are some beiges, it's not stark white, but then they also put up these very mid-tone colors in the chandelier. So they're not super bright. They have been diffused a bit in order not to be too shocking in this space that's really sort of quiet. So even though this brings in a lot of color, it still feels relatively quiet color as opposed to this, which is sort of shocking and standing out at you. And then harmony and unity. So this is sort of how we are organizing our principles. So it starts to ensure that things feel connected. So again, we can do that with color. So both of these interiors are pretty much neutral color palettes. They're white, beige, and then maybe a little bit of black. You don't want to have a whole lot of clutter when you are trying to make something look harmonious and in unity. Even though my preferred style sort of is maximalist, I will say that your eyes start to bounce around. There's so much to look at. Whereas in a space that wants to feel harmonious, you just sort of want to rest. You don't want to be bouncing back and forth. So it is a space that has less clutter, less things. So scale and proportion, we talked about this in the last one too. Remember our fish guy? We're going to see him again. So again, this sofa, really too big for this space. It makes the space look really small. And it looks like there's very little space to get around this table. These things aren't necessarily the best organized on that wall to help that idea. And so again, it all really depends on what your goal for the space is. So I'm not saying that you never can use this sofa in this space, but how are you designing it so that it looks like it's done on purpose? In my opinion, this just looks like they wanted a big sofa and they didn't take into account ceiling height or how big the space was. So this, for me, looks awkward fitting in that space. Not to say that it couldn't be done. I think if a designer really put their mind to it, they could find a way to make this look like it's supposed to be there. Same with this fixture. Although it's lovely, right? For me, the scale of it in this space is too big because I really want to know what this thing is behind it. Like, to me, that feels like a focal point in the space. And this is so big, it's just kind of covering it up. Had this been a little bit shorter or had it been see-through, I think it would have been better. So in my opinion, these two don't necessarily work in terms of scale. These are feel a little bit better, right? So I'm able to move around the space. It feels open. It feels light. Space around the bed. When I look at this fixture, I still understand what's happening behind. The lines here sort of start to complement and repeat the lines that are happening in the back. So there's some repetition in form here. Yeah, so thicker lines happening on the side, thinner lines happening in the middle. So this is our guy, right? So again, scale and proportion working together. When I look at this, I say, oh, a close-up of a fish in the ocean. But now when the guy is there, I'm like, that's a really big fish. So those two things, scale and proportion, have to work together. So one of the things that makes really successful design spaces is that when you are using a variety of those things. So like when we started discussing in the beginning of this lecture, that you have all of these elements, the line, the form, the texture, the color, all of these really fun things, and how you put them together are the principles. So again, all of this really depends on your client, because I pulled this picture and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. But then I look at it, go, oh, it's kind of cluttered. There's a lot going on. All of these collections, I like it. I would, hang out there for a while. I'm not sure if I would want to live there. But when I look at it, it does create a bit of a sense of chaos, even though there's unity in color. There's unity and uniformity in like picture size and how they're organized. So this is one way that you're going to have a variety of objects to most people's eyes, and in a staging environment or a styling environment, this might be too chaotic. For design, if this is your client's personality, it's perfect. Right? When I get over here, I'm using those exact same principles. I have a sort of a traditional button tufted ottoman that looks sort of velvety. I have this, so that's one texture. I have this ball, right, which is a different shape, and it looks more like a jute, like a scratchy texture. I have a traditional square sofa here with a round table, a very traditional chair, a sort of moderate chair, a very modern sculpture, a sort of transitional wallpaper. So there are a lot of different styles happening here, and I would even say some maybe unexpected color choices. So I have this blue ottoman that's in the center, and then I have the blue pillow that's pulling it up here. I have the jute with the gold roses pulling it, the sculpture a little bit in the art, and then I have that same tone in the wallpaper. So, it has color choices that work together, but maybe a little bit unexpected, but it also has all of these different sort of eclectic pieces, but somehow it's working and it's not chaotic, right? It doesn't have all of these little pieces. The color palette is softer, not as bright, not as chaotic. So again, both work depending on what the situation is. And that is the end. I will see you guys next week.